Welcome to the section on bystander intervention. We're just going to be talking about what that means, what that looks like, and how it's important to sexual assault and domestic violence. So we will just jump right in. So bystander intervention, the premise is to understand and identify abusive and violent behaviors and precursory red flags, to provide tools and techniques for how to safely intervene, and to promote pro-social behavior, which is any action intended to help others. So a lot of times terms like intervention and prevention are used interchangeably or incorrectly, but there is a difference between those two, and that is that prevention refers to efforts to prevent a negative outcome from happening in the first place. So we might consider vaccinations to be a prevention tool, whereas intervention refers to efforts that are made to mitigate already existing situations, such as antibiotics. So that's an intervention versus vaccines are a preventive effort. Intervention leads to changes in interpersonal interactions that can then lead to changes in culture, which then circles back to being prevention. So intervention is needed to make those changes in the situation that we have now, but eventually could hopefully circle back into becoming a preventative strategy. So bystander intervention is important because we are all affected when we have violence in our communities. Gender violence is not a women's issue, but it's an issue for everyone. And the bystander intervention is an inclusive prevention strategy that everyone can take part of, and acknowledges that most of us are not perpetrators of abuse and don't condone violence. And that so the most of us can then help make change in society. Bystander intervention also believes that we all have a moral responsibility to take action, and that when we don't speak up about things, we send a message that we accept violence, that it's an acceptable part of our society. And so we need to shift our views to help find allies and co-conspirators in bystander intervention to make that change. So bystander intervention focuses on social emotional learning, or SEL. And SEL is a process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply knowledge, attitude, and skills necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, and establish and maintain positive relationships and make responsible decisions. So by focusing on those things, we can create a cultural climate where gender violence is no longer acceptable, and puts the responsibility of prevention on everyone else besides the victim. And then also, again, it doesn't view all men as perpetrators or all women as victims. So some tips about sort of how to go about intervening as a bystander. You want to make sure that you're in a situation where it's safe. This isn't always the case. If there's weapons involved or something, then it might not be safe for you to intervene in that way. You want to make sure that your actions won't result in violence against someone else. It helps to attempt to draw the attention of others nearby to a situation. The more people that you have on your side, the more likely you are to be able to make a difference. You might be able to attempt to distract a potential perpetrator if you don't have other people around, just enough to sort of disrupt the violence, maybe let the other person get away. If you hear conversation that supports things like rape culture, or demeans others, or sounds offensive or violent, don't be silent. That silence is basically complicity. So it's the classic if you see something, say something type mentality. Go ahead and try and call people out for those negative behaviors. If you are not comfortable with a verbal intervention, you can even just maybe walk away. If you're in a friend group and they're saying things you don't agree with, it may be effective, just as effective, to just walk away from the conversation. In some cases, it's not safe for you to do something, to act on your own in that moment. So even seeking help for the situation can also be considered bystander intervention. So it might be, calling law enforcement or something like that is also considered bystander intervention, because you're still doing something to try and help make the situation better and safer. An intervention doesn't have to result from one person's action, so it could be, a group effort or something like that. So bystander intervention is different than other types of prevention because of the way that it approaches the subject. Many prevention efforts are gender specific. So it's based off the assumption that men are perpetrators and women are victims. And so bystander, again, doesn't take that mentality. And it sees everyone as sort of potential people who can help stop violence and abuse. And it helps dispel, therefore, a lot of victim blaming rationales, because then we're not assuming anything about anyone being the victim or the perpetrator, and it helps to raise awareness and encourage people to take an active role in ending violence and empowering people to become prevention mentors. So there are a few different types of tiers of prevention and intervention. So typically, there's primary, secondary, and tertiary. And the primary means that this is an approach that takes place before sexual violence has occurred to even prevent any initial perpetration or victimization. So that's hopefully getting in and doing some education that would change people's minds about something before they even did anything to anyone else. Secondary typically refers to an immediate response after sexual violence has occurred to deal with the short-term consequences of violence. So that's people like us, where this immediate sort of response to a victim to help them deal with the trauma immediately following the assault. And then tertiary refers to longer-term responses after a violence has occurred to deal with the lasting consequences of violence, which include things like sex offender treatment interventions. This can also include things that we do. We stick around with our clients for a long period of time sometimes. When we talk about prevention in schools, it's a little bit different. They use the same terms, but it's just applied a little bit differently when inside the school setting. So the primary prevention is something that is applied to all students and takes place before violence occurs. So this is like, holding an assembly for all students about something and hoping to make a difference before anything bad happens. Secondary prevention is for at-risk students. It also includes that immediate response that we talked about in the previous slide for secondary prevention, but is also might be something that's targeted towards at-risk students specifically. And then tertiary prevention also has that long-term response that we talked about in the previous slide, but also is things that can be focused on students who have been affected by violence or abuse. So it sort of narrows down the population from everybody at the primary level, at-risk students at the secondary, and then people who have already been affected by it in the tertiary level. For both in schools and out of schools, secondary and tertiary prevention is actually intervention at that point because something has already happened. So it's technically intervention instead of prevention, but we still call it prevention. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention created this 4-level ecological model that helps us to understand factors that influence violence. It's important to understand that there's no single characteristic that motivates a person to become a perpetrator of violence. That is often a combination of things in each of these 4 levels that combine to contribute to make someone becoming a perpetrator of violence or a victim. So understanding these factors can help us identify opportunities for prevention strategies. And these strategies should include a continuum of activities and components that stretch across these 4 levels to be the most effective. If you just target one, it's not as likely to be effective as if you can target several or even all of them. So the 4 levels are just the individual, relationship, community, and societal. So you can read on the slide what that means, but you can see that it's sort of grows in its scope of like how many people that might encompass and how big of a sort of area or population that might encompass. So I'll give you just a minute to look at the influences listed under each of the 4 levels. Okay, so we're going to look at just a different way to present that information in this tree model rather than just like the stacking ovals of the previous one. So this goes, leaves are the individual, branches are the relationship level, the trunk is the community level, and then the roots are the society level. So I kind of like this metaphor because it helps illustrate just how everything is connected and how deeply some of those deep or strong with roots and a trunk, those connections are that we have to society and our community and how much they can influence our perceptions and behaviors. So here's some core components of primary prevention. So that's trying to get in there before anything happens. These efforts should be comprehensive. So we must try to address risk factors at different levels of that ecological model, so that we can address the interconnectedness of behaviors and relationships and societal norms, and to acknowledge that certain behaviors that we may be trying to target don't exist in a vacuum, but are related to others and reinforce others, so that we can't be most effective without addressing those interconnections again. And understanding that making changes at those different levels will help to ensure a longer lasting change. We should try and make these prevention strategies long term. A one-time intervention, might make a difference to someone, but as soon as, if you give one class to a group of kids, as soon as that's over, then your impact is ended basically with the kids that took that class. So it's not really going to be carrying on to any future generations or students the next year or anything like that. And not only that, but we must try and have follow-up. So if we have the one class, it also is more effective if then we give the class and then have follow-up with that group rather than just sort of a one and done, like, here you go, and then not following up with them to reinforce the skills and attitudes that were implemented during that one intervention. Um, it's best if primary prevention strategies are community driven. Um, our communities know how to identify and solve their own problems. So it's best if we have input from the community before we try and implement something. Because an outsider might be way off base of as far as like what needs to be done or what needs to be addressed. Um, Also, this way, you get buy-in from the community members and trying to solve their own problem and really making an investment in that, rather than just being like, "Oh, these people are coming in and doing it." I guess that's nice. Um, and also helps to support victims so that they don't feel like they're alone to solve the problem when they have the backing of their community saying, "We know that this is a problem and we're trying to fix it with you." Um, you want to be strategic about how you implement prevention strategies. You want to make sure that you're targeting specific populations and risk factors and areas based on like a reason, not just because you think that this group should have some kind of intervention, but because you recognize that they may be at risk for a particular issue or something like that. You want to have a reason behind how you're implementing the program. You also want to ask the question of why when you're doing this work. Why are you educating this population? Why now? Etc. To help guide, where you're implementing these programs. If you don't have a good answer to those, then it maybe it's best to try and apply an intervention elsewhere. And finally, it's important for these strategies to be population based. You should try and impact several, as many people as you can at one time. Not only because then you're actively impacting more people, but then it helps spread the information faster. So we don't want to just like try and target one person at a time, but it's better to try and hit as many people as you can. So there is a lot of ways to try to address sexual violence, and primary prevention is just one of those. Um, Efforts now are trying to sort of take a more holistic approach to sexual violence, to um, focus on services to victims, which is great, but then it also sort of leaves a hole in addressing the prevention and the education within the community to try and prevent that from happening. Um, this kind of approach is reactive and kind of seems to enforce the idea that we just accept that sexual violence is part of our community and we just have to manage it rather than try to prevent it. So I have a background in public health, and metaphor that we use a lot in public health to sort of illustrate this kind of issue is if you're standing on a riverbank and you see someone floating by who's drowning, you jump in to save them and you pull them out, and then another person and you jump in and pull them out, and you keep doing this, and you may be saving them, but the effort put into it is a lot, and you're just doing one person at a time. But if you have a friend who goes upstream a little ways and finds that there's like a hole in a bridge, and that's people keep falling in it and falling into the river, and they can go upstream and fix the hole in the bridge, and that one action saves all of the people walking by there rather than one person at a time as you're pulling them out of the river. So primary prevention is an effort to fix a hole in the bridge rather than pull people out of the river one at a time. This is a diagram of how we are socialized to accept all kinds of things in society. But specifically, we're talking about different forms of oppression and sexual violence, which in order to eliminate that, we need to eliminate the sexist attitudes that we're socialized to accept from when we're very little. And this is where intervention and prevention can be used to change this cycle that we see here, where we sort of start on the upper hand left side where it says born into the world, and then we go around and we're socialized to certain things by our parents and family and community members. And then as we grow older, it just becomes more reinforced by the rest of society. As we become more aware of, people outside of our close community group. And then we come down, we get to a point where there's, a lot of anger and violence happening. And then right here is where if you can implement an intervention, you might be able to get people to take that arrow that points down out of the cycle where they make a change and they take a stand and they question what they have just sort of assumed for their lives. That's where we're trying to hit people. But if we don't get them, then they're going to go back to not doing anything to change it, not making a difference, and then the cycle will just keep continuing with next generations of people. So this is our Disney princess slide. So you can take a minute to read what our Disney princes are teaching society about what men should do to attract women. So you can see that there's a running theme there of being rich, charming, famous, and good looking. But so we usually, when we do this training in person, we have a discussion about what it means to, quote, act like a man in society. So we can think about things of how men are supposed to be different from women, and that might be things like that they're strong and tough, or they're always in control of the situation, and that real men are only supposed to have feelings like anger or feeling superior and confident, and then they express their feelings through yelling or fighting or just remaining silent. And sexually speaking, real men are supposed to be aggressive and dominant and heterosexual. So those are some things that we're socialized to accept and assume about how men are supposed to act. And so then now we're going to look at our Disney princesses slide that talks about how Disney portrays how women act and what they're supposed to do. So I'll give you a minute to read through the characteristics of our Disney princesses here. So again, we can see that there's a little bit of a theme running through here, that largely the women, the Disney princesses, are saved by basically their looks in some way. Oftentimes, that's what they rely upon to save the day or whatever. So again, what are the traits that we are socialized to accept and approve in what real women are supposed to act like? So women are supposed to be nicer, maybe weaker or more submissive, and maybe gossipy compared to men. And women, are allowed to have feelings such as fear, sadness, low self-esteem. It's totally acceptable and almost expected for women to have low self-esteem. And when they don't, it's like, whoa, like, it's not viewed well. Oftentimes it's like overly confident. Real women can express their feelings through crying or screaming or being hysterical, that kind of thing. And women, sexually speaking, are supposed to like follow the men's lead. They're not supposed to sleep around, but they are supposed to be pleasing to their partner, and that kind of thing. So those are some often typical ways that women are viewed and expected to behave by society. So now we're going to take this a little step further and think about what men and women are called when they don't conform to all the things that we just talked about, of what they're expected to look like or act like. So for men, a lot of times this is, and again, often the words that come up with this are not particularly polite or nice to hear, and that's okay. In our discussions, we try and keep them accurate to what is said in the real world, which is often not very nice things. So for men who don't act like, strong or confident or aggressive or dominant, some labels that they might encounter are things like wimp, gay, queer, pussy, things like that, that are insulting to essentially to their masculinity. And then women who do not act like nice and weak and low self-esteem and don't act sexually how we want them to, those women may encounter labels like dyke, tomboy, slut, whore, lesbian, or bitch. And then once people gather those labels, more often then they're subject to actions or reactions by people who don't approve of how that they are living outside of the boxes that we've sort of designated. So they may be harassed or abused, ignored. So see in the media, these gender roles are perpetuated. To continue to enforce these gender roles of how men and women are supposed to act, and that if you don't act that way, there will be social consequences, essentially. So these are some scenes from TV and movies. We have Big Bang Theory, where there's the kind of classic, beautiful, but not very intelligent woman. And then in Game of Thrones, that series is very rape heavy. I think I read somewhere that in the first 5 seasons there are 50 acts of rape and 29 or 39 rape victims. So that show is just like constantly reinforcing that, normalizing rape is something that happens. And then 50 Shades of Grey is, regardless of your thoughts on like BDSM type behavior, the way that the characters are portrayed in these books and movies are heavily weighed towards the man being the dominant figure and the woman just sort of like thoughtlessly going along with whatever he says. And then, we also have the Tudors in their sort of violent looking promotion poster. We also see this in advertising. You can just take a look at these ads that are very like sex sells type heavy. And the, to the point of being rather vulgar in the case of the ketchup ad. It's pretty like explicit. The one in the top right is, I don't know, some like high fashion ad, I think, which is this scene is rather common where there's often like a woman sort of laying and then there's all these men around her that gives a little bit of a gang rape vibe. And then we also see this in music, both in lyrics and visual presentation of music videos or live performances that are, heavily sexualized or objectifying and supportive of rape culture in general. The same can also be said for video games. The one in the middle is from Grand Theft Auto, which is a game where you get points, I guess, for like running over or killing prostitutes. So that obviously is problematic as far as gender violence goes. And then you can see that in the scenes from these other video games. I don't know what games they're from, but they're pretty graphic in terms of sort of a sexual assault standpoint. So we see this kind of thing around us all the time, unfortunately. And it's really important for us to think about things like, how does this affect the world? Like, how does it change our perceptions of gender roles and gender violence? How do they challenge or reinforce these stereotypes? And how do people respond to those things? What does it imply for users of products of the things that these ads are trying to sell? How does musical lyrics and whatnot affect our perceptions? I've certainly been guilty of being a fan of a catchy song and having fun singing along to it, and then sort of realizing what the lyrics are and then going, oh, like, I don't feel real great about this song anymore, but it's really catchy. And then, how video games, there's long been an argument that video games normalize violence in general, but for us specifically, does it normalize violence against women? So other points of discussion that normally we would talk about as a group, but that you can maybe just sort of think about to yourself. Again, how are women and men who do not accept and adopt the characteristics of their gender perceived in our society? Can you think of ways that gender roles have changed and or been challenged in your lifetime? And think of cultural icons who are popular right now. Who fits the common gender stereotypes and who breaks them? And how are they received when they break them? How do people respond? An example that I can think of off the top of my head is the evolution of Miley Cyrus. When she was young and was Hannah Montana, like, she was this wholesome young girl that people really liked and thought she was cute, and good thing for an okay thing for kids to watch and everything. And then when she sort of moved on from that show and really became like her own individual artist and person outside of that character, she cut her hair and changed the way that she dressed and her makeup and her behaviors and everything became quite different, and a lot of people reacted fairly negatively to that, and had a lot of unpleasant things to say about the new version of Miley Cyrus. So that's just sort of an example of what happens with with people who do that, break out of the gender norms that are accepted. So there is beyond just sort of an interpersonal level of sexism that happens, there is a larger issue of institutional sexism and how it affects women, but in general society. So gender roles are determined by socialization that delegate who can have positions in the economic, political, and social realms. So, more men. The percentage of women who are like CEOs of major companies is tiny. The percent of elected officials that we have representing us in our government is also rather small, considering women are half the population. Women are not simply discriminated against, but they are often actively exploited and oppressed. Fortunately, we have seen recent changes in the last few decades of how women, function and are treated in society. Things have gotten better. However, women are still get paid less than men in like equal employment situations. Can be like 75 or 77 cents on the dollar for white women, but for women of color, it can be as low as like 60 or even lower, I think. So again, there are fewer leadership positions in the political sphere. Their social standing and worth may be defined by the men in their lives, so depending on who they're married to or who their fathers may be, may have a larger effect on how they're viewed by society than who they are individually. And physically, women have issues with being allowed to have access to or control of reproductive health services, so they're not necessarily able to have 100% control over their own bodies currently. Oftentimes, public policy that we have fails to address the specific needs of women or potentially actively even works against it. And part of this is because women are often underrepresented. As we said, we don't have an equal share of women representing us in political office. And so when that's who makes public policy and women are absent from that stage, it makes it really difficult for policies to be put forward that are, purposefully trying to take women's particular situations into account. And finally, because of an institutionalized system of sexism, a lot of women may sort of be socialized and trained and raised to look to men for protection, or whether that's financially or physically or whatever. We're taught to rely on men to help get us through the world rather than being able to do it on our own. So we talked about rape culture in the Sexual Assault 101 training, but we'll touch on it again here. So this is when sexual violence is condoned, normalized, excused, or encouraged through societal norms or media. And it's not scientifically causally linked to sexual violence, but that doesn't mean that there's not a link there anyway. So this is things like, no means yes, calling someone a tease, thinking that it's unfair to deny someone sex if they are already aroused. Other phrases like hit that, get some, score, things like that are all supportive of rape culture. So to be good active bystanders, here are some things that we can do to be proactive and positive steps we can take to help improve or the situation of gender violence. We can hold those around us accountable for their behavior and try to interrupt disrespectful behavior that we see. Work together to try and make a difference in your own life. Ask for consent and communicate clearly about sex with your partner. Don't be afraid to talk with other people about these issues. The more people talk about them, the more we are likely to make a change. Try to identify and eliminate language that removes or absolves the perpetrator. If you'll think back again to the sexual assault section where we talked about Julia Penelope's work on sentence structure and going from John raped Mary to Mary as a rape survivor. Trying to be conscious of that and working to remove that type of language. And then again, just encouraging others in your life to get involved and to also try and do these things to help make a difference. So I think out there have been campaigns that would be classified as prevention, I suppose, that are like 10 ways to not get raped, which really, again, plays into the victim blaming sort of scheme of things of how not to get raped rather than teaching people to not rape. So someone went and like flipped this and made it 10 ways to prevent rape and then made it on the perpetrator, potential perpetrator, rather than on the potential victim. So I'll just give you a minute to read these ones and then the ones on the next slide as well here in a minute. Okay, and then we're gonna read the other 5, so go ahead and read those. So I think sometimes people read these and it's kind of funny because it sounds so ridiculous, but I think that helps to highlight like how easy it should be to not rape somebody. But the message gets lost and people do it anyway. But I wish that this was more along the lines of what we taught rather than like carry a rape whistle, blow it if you're about to get raped, but carry a whistle if you think you're about to rape someone, blow the whistle until someone stops you. I wish that was more the tack that we took in education. But next, these are serious ones, not sort of the tongue-in-cheek of the previous ones, but these are things that men can do to prevent gender violence. So number 1, approaching gender violence as a men's issue. Men should not be viewed only as perpetrators or possible offenders, but as empowered bystanders who can confront abusive peers. If you have someone who is abusing their female partner or is disrespectful or abusive in general, try to talk to that person about it if you feel comfortable. Try to get them to seek help or talk to someone else about how you might be able to help them, but mainly just, if possible, don't remain silent about it. Number 3, try and question your own attitudes. Don't be defensive when someone calls you out for saying or doing something that may be perceived as hurtful to someone else. Instead, try to understand how your attitudes and actions may perpetuate sexism and violence, even if that's not your intention, and how you can work to change it. If you think that a woman that you know is being abused or has been assaulted, in a sensitive manner, ask if they want to talk about it or if you can help. If you are the abuser or have been in the past, you can seek help for yourself as well. And no point in waiting. Might as well try and get that done now to prevent as much future pain on someone else as possible. Try and be an ally to groups and people who are working to reduce gender-based violence. Do things like attend Take Back the Night rallies, raise money or volunteer for shelters or organizations like Project Hope. If you belong to a team or a fraternity, hopefully your group, whoever it is, isn't involved in anything like this, but if it is, maybe you can try and step in and say something. Or if they're not, hopefully you can maybe organize a fundraiser or some other kind of awareness event to help just shine a light on these issues. Speak out against homophobia when you can. This abuse has direct links to sexism, and helping to speak out against that will help that population as well as women in general, because the more people that we have questioning that kind of accepted behavior, the better. Take the time to educate yourself and others about how social forces affect the conflicts between individual men and women. So talking about the root causes of gender violence and gender inequality, and learning more about it, and something you can share with other people. Try not to fund sexism by buying magazines, videos, music, etc. that is degrading to women. Do what you can to protest that kind of messaging in the media that we consume. And then finally, volunteer to work with gender violence prevention programs, including anti-sexist men's programs. Be a mentor. Do whatever you can to lead by example. This is the Dating Bill of Rights. I think we have 2 slides of this, so I'm going to give you a minute to read through the first one, and then we'll go on to the second part of it. Okay, and here is the second part of it. Okay, so now we're just going to sort of build on that a little bit and talk about healthy relationships. So the basis of a healthy relationship is having shared and equal power, and this is the best way to protect yourself and each other from abuse in the relationship. So this means that people have equal power in decision making, that they have the individual freedom to disagree or change or leave the relationship. They have equal rights to independence and expressing one's feelings, needs, thoughts, and desires. And they have equal access to support, resources, and personal space. It's important for healthy relationships to have good communication, good personal boundaries, good conflict resolution skills, and self-awareness. Building a little bit on that personal boundaries point, so these are psychological and physical separations that we make between ourselves and others, and they help to protect us and see our responsibilities and priorities and establish our right to exclude others from interfering with things that we don't want them to. So there's 3 different types of boundary strengths. There are healthy boundaries, which give good protection, give us information about when it feels safe to allow someone else to be physically and or emotionally close to us. They allow us to act appropriately and to keep us from offending others. Weak boundaries are those that give little or no protection from the abuse of others. If we have poor boundaries, we are more vulnerable to being controlled and manipulated by others and have our self-esteem damaged. And then the last one is walled boundaries, which give the ultimate in protection. However, we feel cut off and emotionally isolated from others. This is usually a result of being deeply hurt and having our trust destroyed. So there's weak and walled sort of on 2 ends of the spectrum, and then healthy in the middle with a good balance there. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we call reduction techniques. So these are things that are often historically have been thought to be sexual violence prevention techniques, but they're not really. They're more of risk reduction techniques. So just because you follow these or employ these or whatever doesn't mean that you won't be assaulted. And so there's no guarantee, but they might be something that you want to do anyway. And again, the CDC defines reduction techniques as primary victimization prevention rather than secondary prevention. But so some of these are things like know your rights, which you have the right to your body, the right to change your mind, the right to be listened to and respected, and the right to set limits in any relationship. You can actively listen, so pay attention to your partner's body language, demeanor, and nonverbal cues. If your partner indicates verbally or nonverbally that they are not okay with what's happening, stop what you're doing. It's best to know your partner's boundaries before engaging in any sexual activity, and don't be shy to ask about how your partner is feeling. Communicate assertively, so we mean to be clear in communicating what you want. If someone is violating your boundaries or personal space, let them know. If possible, say no when you mean no and yes when you mean yes. And be aware that perpetrators often use alcohol and or drugs to wear down and influence potential victims. Trust your instincts. If your gut tells you something isn't right, just get out of the situation. And don't be afraid to be rude or make a scene. In the long run, it's worth doing that. Again, just because if you happen to use any of these tips doesn't guarantee prevention. And even if you don't use the tips, that doesn't make, if you're assaulted, it doesn't make it your fault. So these are options and they have no bearing on whether or not you may, end up having to experience some kind of assault. Also, try not to perpetuate culture that tells you that you don't have control over responsibility for your actions. You can always tell friends, family, neighbors, coworkers, acquaintances that it is never okay to sexually assault or rape someone. You can pass it on that it is never the victim's fault, and you can notify police with permission from the victim if you have information on someone that has perpetrated or has been victimized. So you don't have to perpetuate that culture, and you don't have to remain silent. Other sort of risk reduction techniques is to avoid dangerous situations. So be aware of your surroundings, try to avoid isolated areas, walk with purpose. You look like less of an appealing target if you're walking, quickly and confidently. Trust your instincts. Try not to sort of tie yourself up with having lots of packages or bags or things that you're holding. Keep your cell phone charged and with you, and have money. Try not to be isolated with people that you don't know, and avoid putting headphones in both of your ears, again, because that reduces your awareness of the surroundings. So we are aware that these are things that go along the lines of teaching people how not to get raped, and that's definitely not our first choice of techniques to try and reduce gender violence. However, the fact is that these things happen. Our prevention efforts have not been yet 100% successful. So keeping that in mind, these might be things that people might want to try to make themselves feel more safe when they are out, knowing that the prevention techniques haven't fully fixed gender violence in our society at this point. Another thing that some people like to do is to take a self-defense course. Similar to the previous things and things that are sort of like don't get raped type mentality, this can be a controversial subject. It could be good for a survivor. They may feel like they feel strong and that they don't feel like they're going to be a victim again if they take a course like this. And it can be empowering whether you are a victim or not. It can be rather empowering to know that you can defend yourself. So whether or not you take a self-defense class, there are some options for how you might react if someone does attack you. There's basically submitting or fighting back. And it's important to note that submitting is not the same as consent, and that it's perfectly okay to do this. Sometimes it's not safe or you're not capable of fighting back, and that it is still rape even if you don't fight back in that moment. However, some people may fight back, may be able to, and if you do that, then it's best to react quickly and maybe yell confidently at your attacker, run away. And if you've taken self-defense, then you would probably have been taught where to apply physical force to vulnerable points in the body to easily and quickly use some moves of self-defense to incapacitate your attacker so that you can get away. So doing some more clarification on some of these terms that we're using, like primary prevention, awareness, and outreach, and risk reduction. Because a lot of them, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, may be used interchangeably or incorrectly. And sometimes people might think that they're offering one thing when they're actually providing one of the others. So an example of the difference here is primary prevention is a school program that teaches students skills to be active bystanders. So that's trying to teach skills to make a difference before anything bad happens. Risk reduction are things like the self-defense classes or the, don't wear your headphones type thing. And then awareness and outreach are school programs. An example is a school program that talks about sexual violence and services from a local crisis shelter. So it's not really teaching anyone a change in their skills or behaviors or attitudes or anything. It's more just providing information about, what's out there. So that's sort of some examples of the differences between those things. And then sort of expanding on that is this quote about prevention that I'll give you a minute to read. Okay. So continuing to talk about risk reduction, the difference between risk reduction and primary prevention can be really difficult to make. As I mentioned before, a lot of times historically, those risk reduction techniques have been sort of sold as prevention. But the problem is that risk reduction programs almost always operate from the assumption that sexual violence is the issue that needs to be addressed rather than focusing on those underlying issues, all those societal factors that influence things. Whereas prevention is created to target those underlying factors. And risk reduction focuses mostly on helping potential victims change their behaviors to avoid being sexually assaulted. So again, it's that like how not to get raped mentality. Talking a little bit further about the awareness and outreach portion is the goal here is to just increase awareness of sexual assault and of places like Project Hope that provide services. And is often focused just on educating people about the dynamics and the issues and prevalence of sexual violence, rather than really trying to teach them how to make a difference about it. And awareness is really critical because if people don't know that there's a problem, there's no point in going any further with any other interventions or prevention efforts. But on its own, it's not going to create the necessary changes in attitudes. We know that information alone doesn't create behavior change. If it did, no one would smoke anymore because everyone, at this point is pretty much aware that it's bad for you, and yet we still have lots of people who do it. So information alone isn't going to make a difference. And then just a little bit, awareness and outreach are slightly different. So outreach is more the piece of educating people about services that are out there rather than the issues that cause the need for the services. But they're often intertwined. This is an article that we read when we're doing training in person that we cannot do here. So now we're going to talk about some risk and protective factors in relation to the likelihood that sexual violence will occur. So risk factors do not include factors that can be altered like age or gender, and they do not include situational factors such as alcohol at a party, and they don't include myths that we perpetuate, like what someone is wearing has an impact on the likelihood of sexual assault. These are things that prevention efforts attempt to address. And again, taking this back to that ecological model, these are connected across the levels of our society. So the societal level risk factors are things like social norms that are supportive of male superiority. At the community level, these are things like poverty mediated through forms of crisis of male identity, so that men who can't provide for their family may feel emasculated. At the relationship level, these are things that are like a strongly patriarchal relationship or family environment. And at the individual level, it's personal hostility towards women. So this is a chart that lists some risk factors, and I'd like to take a minute to point out that these are risk factors for perpetration of violence. These are not risk factors of who is at risk of becoming a victim. These are risk factors that may determine who becomes a perpetrator. So I think that's a really important distinction to make, that's where we're trying to aim our efforts. Again, it's that to teach not to rape rather than how not to get raped. So I'll just give you a minute to look through some of these. It's a little repetitive of the ecological model, but I'll give you a minute to look this over. Okay, and you'll notice that under community and society level, we have things that talk about weak community sanctions or weak laws and policies. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more here. Just to highlight a little bit why this is a risk factor. And that's because it's really indicative of norms in a society. If a society doesn't have strong sanctions and penalties against perpetrators of sexual violence, then that's a pretty strong indicator that that society is, fairly accepting of that kind of behavior. So it really sets the tone that that community doesn't take sexual violence seriously and doesn't see it as a problem. Again, in these societies, it just sort of shows that women's issues don't really carry the same weight as men's issues. And so often there may be laws that are in place but aren't really enforced. And so it's not really a good deterrent for people who perpetrate sexual violence, because they know they're not really going to be held accountable. And therefore, on the whole, sexual violence pretty much goes unpunished. So now we're going to look on the flip side. We talked about risk factors, and now we're going to talk about protective factors. Again, these are protective factors for those who may perpetrate violence, not protective factors for those who may become victims. There's a lot less research around protective factors than there is around risk factors. However, there is something that the Search Institute put out called the 40 Developmental Assets that are defined as concrete, common sense, positive experiences and qualities essential to raising successful young people. These assets have the power during critical adolescent years to influence choices young people make and help them become caring, responsible adults. So some of the things that they list as protective factors are positive family communication, adult role models, positive peer influence, youth valued as resources, caring neighborhood, high value on equality and social justice, peaceful conflict resolution skills, and safety. So we can see that there's like a pretty good sort of opposites relationship between the risk and the protective factors. So, for example, if you'll remember, a risk factor is having sexually aggressive peers, while a developmental asset is having a positive peer influence. So there's sort of that, you know, two sides of the same coin kind of thing as far as the risk and protective factors go, which makes sense. That having, peers that go one way versus another way may, influence you to go one way or the other. So now that we've gone through all of that, we're going to go through I think a couple of scenarios, two scenarios that you may run across to help you sort of put into practice the bystander skills that we have talked about. So the first one is the high school foul ball scenario. So I'll give you a minute to read this. Okay, so now we're going to look at some potential options of what actions you might take after having encountered this situation. And you can just kind of decide for yourself which one. There isn't exactly a right or wrong answer, depending on the situation. Any one of these might be the best way to act. But so just read through these and kind of see which ones feel right to you. It might help you if you're ever in a situation like this, might help you know ahead of time what you might say in this kind of situation. So I'll give you just a minute to look at these different options. Okay, and then scenario number 2, high school illegal motion. I'll give you a minute to read through this one. And then again, here are some options for how you might react in that situation. So I'll give you a minute to look through those and kind of decide what feels right to you. Again, there's not really a right or wrong answer here. Okay, and then last thing to wrap up, just some things to remember, hopefully take going forward. For anyone, I think this is sort of targeted towards men, but just be aware of what we hear around us in the media and our friends and family, and don't be afraid to talk about these issues with other people. Don't be afraid to talk about consent or getting a woman's perspective, or a man's. Ask guys, like, what is going on with this. Be careful with your own words, and try and get involved and speak out in support of reducing gender violence. Last little thing here, if you had any comments or questions that came up for you, I hope you wrote them down and we can talk about them later. Also, don't forget to take the quiz that's associated with this section. And I hope you learned some things about bystander intervention.